FOSTA-SESTA changed the sex worker justice movement forever. Even though the law has barely been used, its existence has had a devastating effect.
But the way the movement has responded also changed everything. Fighting FOSTA-SESTA made us stronger. It changed how others perceived us. Many of the people we spoke with hope that strength will eventually help us to decriminalize all kinds of sex work in the United States.
For example, the mutual aid networks we developed were undeniably powerful. And when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States in early 2020, sex workers were ready to care for one another. Here's Jared again.
I bring up COVID just because I think that those early hours of the pandemic were some of the best organizing I've ever seen sex workers do, as far as starting mutual aid funds in order to keep people safe or to, reduce harm for people. And I think that even though, COVID was the happy days, we didn't know that COVID was going to happen. But at the same time, the idea of doing organizing like that, or even frankly doing the sort of organizing that groups like Red Canary do, where they're connecting people to services and resources and information, there was a lot of fear that even just that sort of work could be either criminalized to the point of hurting the people that were doing that work, or that SESTA-FOSTA could have such a chilling effect that that work wouldn't be able to even continue in the meaningful ways that it was already doing. After SESTA-FOSTA, because I think sex workers were a lot more organized and were more galvanized and were just more connected to each other, especially sex workers that tend to be more political. I think that a lot of that infrastructure actually enabled a lot of the mutual aid funds that I saw really, I'm sure those funds would have existed even if some of the infrastructure that was built because of fighting back against SESTA and some of the other stuff happened. But I do think that that infrastructure that was built really enabled a lot of those mutual aid funds to be as successful as they were. It certainly helped bring donations to those mutual aid funds. Organizing is a skill, it's a muscle. And having really exercised that muscle for the fight back against SESTA-FOSTA and then other bills that came after it or that were proposed after it, I think that the tools and the skills that people gleaned from those fights actually really helped a lot of the mutual aid and other organizing that happened because of the pandemic. I think that it made it a lot more effective. However, at the same time, there was also fear because with the pandemic, there were also other bills that were SESTA-FOSTA-esque, and I'm really talking about the Earn It Act, but there were also other bills that were really moving through Congress at that same time, or at least that we feared were moving through Congress at the same time. So to one extent, you had more infrastructure for organizing that certainly helped with a lot of the mutual aid funds. But at the same time, you also had a lot of fear of, could this go away right away? Or, some of the information sharing. What is the impact of SESTA-FOSTA going to be with the information sharing that is necessary to do this sort of organizing? So there was the good and the bad.
But there's strife within the sex worker movement too. It's not just us against the world. Here's Zara Raven of Hacking Hustling.
There is a lot of internalized whorephobia among sex workers. So I'm going to be patient and I'm going to talk to you and I'm going to work through, support you in working through any fears or hangups you have. There are a lot of sex workers who are survivors who, aren't yet questioning criminalization as a strategy. That's all they've been exposed to and don't have other ideas yet about how to keep themselves safe. And so supporting people in accessing new strategies without shaming people for using whatever strategies that they've used to survive or that they continue to use to survive. So different strategies for different people, depending on what level of power they hold and what their experiences are and what kind of relationship I want to have with them. There are some people that I talk to and there are some people that I fight.
FOSTA-SESTA affected everyone differently, but it affected everyone in the sex industry. There's a term we use in the movement, hierarchy, which refers to the social stratification within the sex industry, as well as inter-community stigma. When Zara talks about internalized whorephobia, that's the hierarchy. Privileged workers believing that putting other workers down will keep them safe, instead of building solidarity. Elizabeth speculates that part of the FOSTA effect is the continued collapse of the hierarchy.
I think this is a fucked up silver lining of SESTA-FOSTA. I would love to see still acknowledging that different areas of the sex industry function in different ways and have different levels of criminalization. And even with criminalized sex work, there's lots of class and race differences there. But like, I wish people would stop shitting all over like full service sex workers. And if they're in an area of the sex industry that's not explicitly criminalized, stop thinking that that means that you're somehow, superior, like the whole like hierarchy. I would love to see demolished, because if there was just like huge more numbers and like more people fighting and talking about this issue, I think we would all be better served. And I guess it's coming from Chicago, where there used to be a lot of stratification and a lot of know your rights workshops were really hard, because people who weren't explicitly full service sex workers would get very twitchy when I would say like, you could also get arrested. And it turned very quickly into like, but I'm not like those people. And I think that has gotten a lot better, but I would love to see it get even more so. Well, I can't speak to other cities as well as I can New York and Chicago, but in like 2008, there was a string of busts on BDSM spaces in New York and Chicago. And I think that put a crack, and then it sort of evolved over the years. But I think no one being able to really functionally use internet spaces, and then also realizing that a lot of folks were using the same tools, brought people together. I would like, this is probably very Pollyanna and maybe not realistic, I would like to think that some people recognized the like absolutely backbreaking levels of work that full service workers, particularly Black and brown trans full service workers, were doing in terms of activism and like putting themselves out there as like being out in media and like doing press interviews so that everyone can benefit. I hope that at least some people saw that and thought like, oh, like I owe a lot to these folks.
Here's Im on how workers who are more privileged can recognize that they are not immune from bad laws.
Thinking about whorephobia and lateral whorephobia and the striations of privilege within different sex working communities, I think that there is like a group of really privileged folks that are like, well, it's not my problem, right? Because I'm legal. I'm like, legal for now, bitch. Like, you really think that this fucking system's gonna stop at what is seen as criminal for now? Like, I would imagine that in certain contexts and certain jurisdictions and states that like being a content creator also probably encounters some of its own limitations as well. And whorephobia across the board hurts everyone. It doesn't fucking matter if you're a legal worker or not. And I would say in my community of folks that I hold dearly, we're never just one type of sex worker. And so decriminalization benefits all sex workers. It benefits all sex workers because it challenges whorephobia and sex negativity and misogyny in so many ways that sex workers, even in the legal sides of things, could benefit from. And it's that like lateral whorephobia that really, really just in some ways makes me really furious and also makes me really disappointed. But that's real. Again, like in every industry, there are all sorts of walks of life and politics even within. Who would have thought? Even in like the adult industry, there's like a mix of that there too. And it is really disappointing at times when people try to distance themselves from folks who are less privileged. Because what the fuck are you using your privilege for? That's great. You're legal now. Awesome. What are you doing with that? You don't have as much at stake as someone who is more marginalized, who perhaps is at more risk, be it because of their gender or race or financial situation or mental health, like so many different things. Like, what the fuck are you doing with your privilege? That's great that you are in a legal industry for now. But just as you had said, like, sex workers, canary in the coal mine, I think like full service workers are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to like the broad sex working industry, including like the legal sides of that. Yeah, what the fuck? Like, what the fuck? Like, yeah, I feel like there is a sense of when folks refuse to acknowledge their power, the probability of them misusing it is so great. Is so great. So like, check your fucking power, check your fucking privilege.
Another fucked up silver lining of this era, again, if you want to call it that, is an overhaul in media narratives about sex work. Here's Blunt.
But I think also something really interesting happened from like from a media analysis standpoint, where the coverage of sex work, I just noticed such a drastic shift in how FOSTA-SESTA was covered from anything else I've been involved in like 10 years of sex worker organizing. And I really think that because FOSTA-SESTA had the potential to impact workers working in legal sectors and highly visible sectors of the sex trades with large social media followings, that the media coverage of FOSTA-SESTA was so different than equally harmful legislation that impact more criminalized and in-person workers. And I think that the protest was really, really visible because of sex worker use of social media. And you would see like the majority, while there was like the really like star-studded FOSTA-SESTA propaganda with like Amy Schumer, there was also a large portion of the media coverage around FOSTA-SESTA had this huge shift where there were photos of us protesting. There was photos of us protesting in the streets instead of like bending over car windows. You know, they would talk about sex workers resisting this legislation instead of prostitutes. And I think the language shift and the imagery shift that happened during this time was really, really huge. And I think it's partially had to do with the visibility because of the impact it had on online workers.
In this era, journalists actually reached out to sex workers for quotes about FOSTA-SESTA. Many sex workers felt they could be real about their circumstances rather than play into stereotypes.
We demanded that media images accompanying articles stop using the same old disembodied legs in fishnets and heels, stepping out of a car in a dark street. Instead, the focus should be on protest signs reading, "Rights not rescue," and "Sex work is work."
Same deal with language. While an individual might identify as a prostitute or hooker or hoe, if a journalist were talking about our labor rights, then they should be using the politicized language of sex work.
Here's Kate on how that media representation changed her conversation with congressional staffers.
I think especially with the amount of response, both publicly from sex workers, but also the level of media coverage and the way that it had been covered, I heard more and more that there was this feeling of, not just with staffers, but with organizations too, who all of a sudden were like, we thought we'd heard all the things from the experts. And the only people who were not the only people who were not listened to, but we weren't listening to the people who were affected, and we weren't listening to the people who were right about what happened. And I think that hit home after FOSTA-SESTA. You know, it was just an epochal shift.
Melissa agrees that FOSTA-SESTA took things too far in conflating sex work and sex trafficking. The media was starting to get the picture. When it comes to labor, choice, circumstance, and coercion is a spectrum, and the pushback from the labor rights movement changed public attitudes, hopefully for the better.
I think it might be helpful to look at SESTA-FOSTA as sort of the capstone achievement of 10 years of advocacy and campaigning on the part of anti-sex work groups who kept hitting this obstacle over and over. You know, when they would conflate sex work and trafficking and try to go after both as if they were the same thing, they would get criticized for that. Sex workers were becoming very effective at getting through to the general public that these are different things. And if someone is coming to you saying, we have to go after sex workers because that's how we fight sex trafficking, that argument, though it certainly still to this day motivates, some law enforcement crackdowns on sex work, at least in sort of the general populace, it was starting to fall apart. You couldn't get people to just do whatever you wanted them to do to harm sex workers, to abolish sex work, which, in their minds was going after sex workers, even though they would say that's not what they were doing. But that's what we know happened when anti-prostitution groups said we have to go after the sex industry. It was sex workers who paid the price. And so they started to pivot from sex work as sex trafficking to the sex trafficking of children is being enabled on these platforms that sex workers just so happen to actually be the majority of users on. And so they would try to sort of like push sex workers to the margin, like, oh no, we're not talking about you. Like the through line here is attacking sex work. The sad, bittersweet thing about FOSTA is I think that was the moment that sex workers were finally able to make that connection. And certainly in like more progressives and liberals' minds, you know, people who weren't sex workers, who were vaguely on the left. Maybe also generationally, things were different. Maybe millennials who kind of grew up online were looking at this differently. But like that's the first time we start seeing polling where people are supporting things like decriminalization, you know, understanding that this was harmful for sex workers to be criminalized. The part that I think lawmakers were able to hide behind, though, was this line of, well, it's not about you, it's about the children. You know, as if you could police this space and the people in it, only some of them.
By and large, American sex worker movements want decriminalization. As we've explored in previous episodes, other strategies like the end demand model of criminalizing clients and managers doesn't make people safe. Legalization introduces more laws and regulations. Decrim is the removal of bad laws. Bad laws like FOSTA-SESTA.
Here's Elizabeth on the importance of decriminalization to sex worker justice and how things might change if we listen to one another.
I think we need cohesive strategy among the states. I mean, obviously each state is different. We all have our own challenges. I think we need broad coalitions. Like this cannot just be either criminal justice or public health, or, you know, you can't just have a one lane. It needs to be a broad table because those relationships that those folks have are so important. You never know who someone in a movement that like, or an organization that's not traditionally seen as progressive may have a buy-in on this, and then they may have relationships. So I think we need to really build relationships with other justice movements and bring them to the table. And also just keep pushing. And because we're always going to have the blowback. Like the more progress we make, the more they're going to push back. And that's just the way it is with any civil rights movement. I mean, we're seeing that in the trans rights space 100,000-fold right now. But I mean, I think public opinion is changing. And I think that's something that we can harness too. And not also just like not being apologetic. Because I think that sometimes happens in conversations about it where there's a both sides instinct that I don't necessarily think we have to have about decrim. We can be empathetic to folks who are very attached to end demand because they think it is truly the right way to keep people safe. But we don't have to say, well, this model that's caused so much harm in other countries, like maybe there's something to be said for it. You know, I think it's okay to say, no, like that is so harmful. It's in some ways worse than criminalization. But we can also listen to like why they think end demand is good. And most of those points, you can go to full decrim and be like, you can have that and more with this model. I personally talked to 3 people in the last, 8 months who were hardcore end demand supporters. And then when they started digging into what full decrim looks like and digging more into what end demand looks like, they flipped.
Here's Jared on what the future of sex worker movements could be.
One of the most frustrating things to me is that even though a lot of elected officials recognize, oh crap, we messed up with FOSTA, this was the wrong thing, we shouldn't have done it. I would hope that they would just repeal it, but that does not seem to be happening, at least anytime soon. The thing that frustrates me even more is that there are additional laws like the Kids Online Safety Act, like a number of other bills that are always floating around that lawmakers aren't, for whatever reason, the muscle memory just isn't there for them to recognize that, hey, we passed this law that was really bad. Maybe we shouldn't do laws that are like it. It's like anytime that a new law comes up, the amount of time and energy that has to go into telling people, maybe Senator Blumenthal should stop trying to regulate the internet because he's really, really bad at it. Like, for whatever reason, there's all of this energy that has to go into that, which I find deeply frustrating because there's just so many other fights that we should be engaged in, that we are engaged in, to be clear. But at the end of the day, there's only 24 hours. And, if you're spending so much of your time ripping hairs out or trying to fight back against the terrible things that Richard Blumenthal or Lindsey Graham or, a number of other people are trying to do, Marsha Blackburn or any of the other ones, it detracts from so much of the other work. So, what I would love to see, and this is starting to happen in several places, but sex worker protection acts. There was a sex worker protection act that was introduced in New York City. And, in other areas, I know that they're looking into this as well, but just bills that would give sex workers, whether they be legal sex workers, so people that maybe are working online, or people that are in the criminalized sex trade, so full service folks or others, legal protections, but labor protections around, with banking, unemployment protections in case people are deplatformed for doing, constitutionally protected speech. I think there's so much that we could be doing to build a better world for people that are in populations that are most likely to do some more marginalized sex work. So again, I'm talking about young people, young queer and trans folks, people that run away from home, people that are in the foster care system. I think there's so much we could be doing to build those folks up. I think there is so much we could be doing for survivors that we're not really doing right now. I just think that we could be, instead of constantly worrying about criminalization, I think that we should be more focused on what reparations will look like for sex workers. And I say that word reparations really intentionally because, while people say that sex work is the world's oldest profession, it's also probably the world's most maligned profession. The number of Supreme Court cases where the justices say, even if we're giving rights to this group, certainly we would never do it for the whores. Just the number of cases where that exists is indicative of the society that we live in, where sex workers are often maligned. Because of that, policing looks the way that it does, the collateral consequences of being a sex worker, whether it be, someone who does online sex work and you're fired from whatever job, whether that be as an EMT or a judge, or I'm giving real examples that have happened in New York in the past few years, or you were a sex worker or you did sex work in the past, and as a result, you had your kids taken away from you by the family regulation system, or you have a record so you can't get a different job or find housing, or if you're a non-citizen and you're at risk of being deported. I think there's just so much that we could do to really give reparations for those folks, to actually fix the systems that did them dirty in the first place, but then also to ensure that we're building those folks up. There's just so much that we could do if we weren't spending all of our time or so much of our time on these fights that, frankly, people should have learned from with the fallout after SESTA-FOSTA passed.
Here's Zara on what it takes to create a safer world.
We live in a context of anti-Blackness, of cis heteropatriarchy, of transphobia, of homophobia, of ableism. We live in that context. I actually, when I was in DC, a lot of my work was addressing sexual violence in public spaces, especially focused on street harassment, and really supporting people in understanding broader community-based solutions. And I liked focusing on street harassment because it was one of those things where it was like people could understand us. Like when we talk about rape, when we talk about intimate partner violence, those acts are criminalized, but street harassment isn't criminalized. And so it's an opportunity almost to start talking about what we could do instead. And one of the areas of my work was specifically sexual harassment on public transit. And often WMATA, the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority, often wanted to install cameras. Like that was like, oh yeah, we'll keep people safe because we could see them, we could watch. I don't know. And or maybe more lighting, like these aesthetic changes. And what I'm interested in is cultural change. And I think that often in the context of capitalism, in the context of policing, we're taught that safety is a quick fix. Safety is a 3-digit number away. Call this 911 and safety comes, right? And we're not encouraged to think and to want more. And never mind the fact that often when survivors call 911 for safety, from their abusers, that they're the ones criminalized. Never mind the fact that when someone's experiencing either, a mental health crisis or just living with disability in this world and behaving in ways that are not normative or not expected or not promoted, that police come with guns drawn, that 50% of people killed by police are disabled folks. So never mind all that. Call this 3-digit number and safety comes. And so what I've been interested in is, how do we create a culture where we keep each other safe, where if we see someone who's feeling uncomfortable, we intervene, we check in, we support each other. And that is the opposite of believing in the stranger danger narrative. Stranger danger narrative says, keep yourself safe. You're, stay in your little house with your little nuclear family. And I'm pushing collectivism. I'm really thinking about, how do we all build communities of care? How do we break through these silos? How do we interrupt anti-Blackness and love Black people? How do we interrupt cis heteropatriarchy and love Black trans women and Black trans femmes? How do we end ableism and attend to all of our different needs and abilities and honor those and value those? So it's just a completely different world that I want to live in. And it's not a quick fix. It's slow, painstaking cultural change. So the work that we did on the DC public transit was really mostly posters. We had a series of posters featuring Muslim women, Black trans femmes. And I think it just said, you deserve to be treated with respect. These messages of respect and support for people who are often most likely to be targeted. This was also around the time of, not that this time has ended, but Muslim bans and just rising Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, which we still see everywhere, especially right now. So yeah, I want cultural change. And that's, to me, how we create safety. When I and my most disabled and my darkest skinned and my fattest friends can walk down the street and feel safe, and the cameras and cops are not meant to protect us, they're meant to police us, to get us to conform to what we're not. It's me doing that inner work and doing that work in my communities and spreading that work far and wide to create a context where violence doesn't happen in the first place.
Here's Desiree on the relationship between decrim and harm reduction.
Because immediately when I think about FOSTA, I still think of it as a backdoor law to so many other things. It's really easy to put the thumb on sex workers because we're already hated. Decriminalization in general, whether you're talking about decriminalization of sex work or decriminalization of drugs, it's about harm reduction. It is the first step because there's so much more that can happen after that. But that is the dam that you have to break through before you can even address some of those root causes. So criminalization of drugs doesn't stop drug use. It doesn't stop people from dying. If anything, it makes it harder in substance use spaces. The idea of doing your drug of choice in a safe manner where someone can help you if you need it is literally life-saving. If you can wrap your brain around that, of something as tangible as overdose bad, living life good, this helps live the life, and then just kind of plop that onto sex work decriminalization. If we can get to a place where we are not criminalized and have more sanctions and frankly more areas that put us into further debt, how are you going to pay for fines of prostitution without doing more prostitution, all of those messy things and life harming things, you can't get to that until you have decrim. You can't save the lives until you can understand the root causes, and you can't understand the root causes until you make people feel safe enough to be vulnerable with you.
And the you here being society and the legal system.
Here's Im on the ways criminalization makes us less safe and how collectivism is the key to resistance.
Just because it's criminalized doesn't mean it stops. It may make things actually more dangerous. There will always be a need for folks to receive reproductive care. There will always be a need for folks to seek out sexual imagery or connection, what have you, and consume or participate in sex work, be it a provider, as that is a valid form of labor, or someone who is seeking to consume that, as be it like a John, a client, just a viewer, a patron, what have you. These things don't disappear. Or rather, they in some ways, they do disappear in that they're less public, right? They have less support around that. So there will always be a need for reproductive care. Always. I think that the reproductive justice community can learn, and probably is putting into application, like there has to be a way. There will be a way that will be just engineered by those who will continue to want to provide support and safety to enact resistance against systems that want to control and take away choice. That resistance can look like so many different ways. And I think it's so essential to always recognize like how folks sit in just the web of privilege and marginalization to see like, what can you do? What can you do? Like, don't just sit on power that is unnamed and relinquish that because you're a little uncomfortable. Like, use that, because every individual working together is what will enact change. It's never going to solely be on one individual.
We could work to get FOSTA-SESTA repealed, but without full decrim, that would only do so much. Here's Blunt.
I think that if FOSTA-SESTA was repealed, that we would have more resources. But I also think that like FOSTA-SESTA did not happen in a vacuum. There have been so many fucking bills that have come out that are trying to exploit the ideas that we have around safety and our fear of like protecting white children from trafficking, that are being like all of these child safety bills that do nothing to protect children, that do nothing to address the root causes of trafficking, that are being used in this very like fear-mongering way where they're getting bipartisan support from legislators that are just increasing surveillance, that are just reducing your ability to share things online, and that will impact everyone. So I think we can't think about FOSTA-SESTA in a vacuum, because legislators saw how effective it was to get support for that bill using language around stopping trafficking to protect the children. That is how we're going to see bills in the future being passed that reduce the privacy and safety of everyone. There'll be surveillance bills, and it will be passed under language of anti-terror language, anti-trafficking language, save the children language. And I think that we really need to educate ourselves of how this rhetoric is being used to pass legislation that decreases our ability to move throughout the world without being surveilled.
We asked Desiree what advice she would give sex workers getting started today in a post-FOSTA-SESTA world. She stressed the importance of sex workers supporting one another, even in the increasingly precarious world of online communication.
Do not follow the advice that I did where it was like, don't make community. That was, it seemed practical at the time for people to say like, oh, don't get involved. Don't, just go in there, do your work and come out. But you have to find community. And especially with full service work, it's more isolating than it is in the club. When I was first getting into full service work, I had some very supportive friends, but they were not sex workers. And they were my safety line. I would tell them when I was going out, if I don't respond by this time, call me. If I don't respond after that, the whole spiel. But I could only talk to them so much about it.
before I found community who were also sex workers and also full service sex workers. I had one friend who we worked together sometimes. I think that we met online. I think it was through one of the subreddits. And she's like, wait, you're in Colorado? I just moved to Colorado too. Let's work together because it's an isolated profession. It's such a freeing moment when you can speak freely about something that you are.
And maybe, just maybe, we can reclaim solidarity as the FOSTA effect. Here's Jared.
So a year after SESTA-FOSTA passed, there was also, I think, just a lot more optimism in rooms and in spaces that I was in. People just, getting sex work decriminalized and getting a lot of these other collateral bills passed, they felt, I don't want to say inevitable because it's 2023 and we haven't gotten everything yet, but it felt like, okay, it's not are we going to win? It's a when are we going to win?
Katie Simon of Whose Corner Is It Anyway thinks that sex worker organizing is getting better at not focusing on decriminalization as the happily ever after. As important as decrim is as a goal, Katie wants us to ask ourselves another question.
I think we've gotten better at this, at not just having this monomaniacal fixation on decriminalization as if legislative change by itself will be sufficient. And not imagining what will the day after decriminalization look like?
We loved this question from Katie, so we asked several of our interview subjects, what does the day after decrim look like? Here's Blunt.
I would take the day off. Maybe a celebration. But I think that, decriminalization means that people can labor without fear from the police, which is a leading source of violence that people in the sex trades experience. It means more access to safety, community, and resources. And I think that it would keep folks safer. It would reduce stigma. And I think it's really important that when we have these conversations about decriminalization, that we're also talking about decarceration and abolition as well. I think less fascism would be helpful. I think that continuing to push media for by and for representation of sex workers. I think we've seen some amazing documentaries come out this year that are very different than documentaries on sex work that we've seen before. I think the continued push to media to do a better job covering sex work, to really explain the complexities of criminalization and the harm that it causes, and the intersecting relationship between stigma and criminalization and marginalization and why people do sex work. I think that media can really, really shift public perception. And I think that it has. I think with what we've talked about with the coverage of FOSTA-SESTA, the media has changed how sex work is talked about. I see it in my friend groups. I see it in my family. I see it in how sex work is covered online.
Here's Jared.
So the day after, I think it really depends on what happens leading up to decrim. So I think the day after, the most immediate need is to get people's records cleared because, we've had criminalization for so long. I think that most real decrim bills or most decrim bills that I would support have a record clearing provision of them. Now, the bill that I write or the bill that any activist writes might be different than the bill that actually gets passed, but ensuring that people's records are cleared in a meaningful way to ensure that folks that maybe are in immigration proceedings, because sex work is what's called a crime involving moral turpitude, which makes it easier to deport people or makes it a lot more difficult for people to adjust their status if they have that on their record. The biggest thing is to make sure that we are taking care of the people that have a prior record. And again, because the collateral consequences being the parts of a criminal record that aren't just throwing someone into jail, I think that for sex work, because they're so broad, from everything from someone's of what involvement in the child family regulation system looks like as far as getting someone's children taken from them, to housing consequences. In New York in particular, there are specific housing laws that really impact sex workers disproportionately. Just making sure that people aren't still suffering from those collateral consequences is really step one. One of the biggest issues with criminalization is also stigmatization, and then a lot of laws that are geared towards people that might just be suspected of potentially being sex workers. In particular, I'm talking about unlicensed massage laws in New York. There are 36 licensed professions in New York. Being a lawyer is one of them, doctors, midwives, lots of other professions. But the only two that are really criminalized are midwifery and unlicensed massage. And there's even a whole special paradigm for how to criminalize unlicensed massage that is literally written into the education law. And the education law is where these offenses are criminalized. And 95% of the people that are criminalized for it are Asian women. It's very intentional. These are people that are expected of being sex workers, but we need to not just get sex work decriminalized, but laws that are meant to also criminalize people that may or not be sex workers, decriminalized as well, and then also look at the collateral laws around that. And then I think there needs to be a real distribution of resources. And so recognizing that decrim is great, but this criminalization paradigm has created a whole lot of harm over a whole lot of years. And so making sure that we're investing in people that are sex workers. Some people that are sex workers, that is a job that they want to do, and they want to continue doing that for the rest of time. And that is okay. And there's some people that are doing sex work because they're a Black trans woman and they were fired from several different jobs. And this is a job that will enable them to have some sort of basically way of paying for their rent, recognizing that we have to serve both of those sets of people. And maybe you're a sex worker that doesn't want to do it anymore, but you just don't have the means to do something else, making sure that we have support for those people, labor protections and everything else. And then also supporting the people that want to continue doing the work. And then even if we decriminalize sex work in New York today, could people do it safely? Well, one of the issues that FOSTA is unfortunately preventing people from having all of the safety tools that they might be able to use. And so there's also, the state policy is so important, but then also repealing laws like FOSTA, making sure that they don't happen. Also just creating harm reduction tools and other mechanisms for people to do this sort of work safely. Decrim, oftentimes Nordic model and prohibitionist supporters, these are folks that allegedly want to decriminalize sex work for the provider, but not for customers. The reality is that every bill that they've ever proposed anywhere in the world, they still criminalize sex workers that live and work together and other folks, and they, still get people caught up in the surveillance state. But a lot of those folks accuse decrim supporters of wanting a wild, wild west for sex work after sex work decrim. And that's really not what we want at all. We want, a framework where people are actually supported and have protections. And I think that really building that infrastructure happens, of course, the day after sex work gets decriminalized, but is also happening in tandem. And frankly, I actually think a lot of that infrastructure is going to be built before we even get to full decrim.
Here's Desiree.
I would love to think that it would be beautiful and magical. But maybe my realist side is like, we would just all be like toasting with our friends, probably over Zoom, because a lot of us are spread out all over the world who do this kind of work. But I think it would be, at least within community, a moment of immense joy and celebration. And then there would be immediately, all right, what do we do now? Like, because of that dam that it has just been broken. Okay, what do we do now? It would be racial and ethnic justice in clubs, and it would be labor laws. There would be so many different things. All those different intersecting movements that are within the community would start to pop up, and that's when we could really get some real work done.
Here's Red of Hacking Hustling.
I think for me, and for trusted co-conspirators that I've been organizing with, it is absolutely essential to remove barriers to survival right fucking now. And that means getting these criminalizing laws of all forms of survival right off the books. There should be no laws that target folks that are trading sex to survive, that are selling, trading, doing drugs to just exist in this world. There should be no laws that prevent people from accessing whatever kind of temporary or permanent housing they need to feel safer, right? Young people who do not feel safe in the home should be able to leave that home and go where they feel safer. And any means that they need to use should be at their disposal, and we should protect, defend, and run to their aid, right? Trans folks should be able to access, right, all the kinds of health and wellness and bodily care that they need. We should be able to have access to the kinds of robust, creative, and educational opportunities that the fucking wealthy have, right? All of these things are actually paths to ending criminalization, right? Like when we have resources, when we have labor that doesn't exploit us, right? When we have the means to organize and self kind of determine what happens to ourselves, our bodies, our families, like we have a better shot at not just surviving, but heaven forbid, thriving and having the kind of power and energy and capacity to really make change because we are nourished. We deserve all of those things. Sex workers, queer folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, disabled folks, like, deserve the whole world. And in the meantime, barriers to survival and access have to be struck from the books. Full stop. Not in these watered down, paltry, crumb-laden ways, but like actually struck from the record. Because if we create laws like what some people are putting forth in legislation, right, toward decrim, and you can pick decrim of drugs, you can pick decrim of houselessness, you can pick decrim of sex work, whatever iteration of decrim you want to choose there. And you look at some of this legislation, it's like decrim for some. But then it still negatively impacts folks without papers, folks who have records, folks who, you know what I mean? Folks who need to access victim services. They have to, perform this other kind of victimhood in order to get what they need. They can't say that I was a sex worker and then something bad happened to me, because then you can't get resources, right? You can't defend yourself against a violent client because then you're going to be seen as, a criminal monster that then is incarcerated. Like there are all of these things that prevent people from surviving and then being punished for any acts of survival. So that stuff has to be struck. And it can't be watered down. It can't come from a place of white saviorist rhetoric and moral policing. It has to just be about people surviving. And that is a tall order. And that is why I currently do not involve myself with electoral organizing or legislative bill organizing. And I'm so thankful for people that are in that lane and do that work. That is not my lane. I have moved far out of that lane, far to the left of that lane. However, we need those things to happen because as so long as there are laws on the books that people can be prosecuted under, right, and by, you can be sure that law enforcement will do their damnedest to round folks up and to punish them. That being said, do I think that the day after decrim, law enforcement will magically, divinely uphold any type of protection or accommodation that decrim belies? No. And no one should think that either. Okay? Because so long as we have cops, so long as we have ICE agents, so long as we have borders, so long as we have prison guards or prisons, right? Or detention facilities or parole officers or truancy officers or any other type of law enforcement, right? That wield guns and make it their entire identity to do violence and brutality to those most oppressed and marginalized, experiencing mental health crises, experiencing houselessness, trying to hustle, walking outside, wearing spaghetti strap tank tops or leggings, carrying condoms, having a little pot on them. The list goes on and on. So long as we have agents of the state who are armed and whose
literal vested interest is to protect private property and the state, we will not see real measurable change. We will still see this kind of violence because we know that that's what those agents do. And it doesn't matter what laws are on or off the books, they will still behave with this kind of impunity and behave with the authority that is vested in them by the state to do violence to working class people or to working poor people. And so the day after decrim is going to look like the day before decrim until we get rid of the cops and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I think it will also mean that we will have to have an even more heightened mutual aid and care response. I think it will mean that we have to continue doing what people have already begun doing, which is building our own methods of advertisement and work. It will have to mean that we control and determine the means of production, right? Not to get all, Marxist, but I will. Sorry, not sorry. But unless we self-determine everything, we will not see change. I don't say any of this to not sound hopeful. I am incredibly hopeful because it is within our capacity and it is within our imagination and it was within our lifetimes that I think and believe that we will see this kind of demonstrable change because I've already experienced things I never thought would happen. I have already, in my 35 short years, right, already seen and experienced and felt things I never thought would come to pass, good and bad. And so I know that radical, major change is possible. I want us to be ready. I want us to ready our hearts and ready our minds and our bodies and take care of each other. My fucking God, we need to be so much more gentle with each other so that we can do this for the long haul. And I think it's possible. But we have to want it and we actually have to do the work to make it happen. No one is going to gift liberation to we have to make it and do freedom work all the time. All the time. You have to make it about the work all the time. And that looks a lot of different ways. And I think that's so beautiful. And I think that's a testament to the power of solidarity, the power of our capacity for creativity. There's so many ways to do this work and to be in struggle and to lend support. We also know this is not popular, but we need class traders because we need cash. So if you're listening to this podcast and you have money, you need to move that money to the right folks at the grassroots level and not the big nonprofits. You need to move money to the grassroots so these mutual aid and care networks can keep people alive. And not just that, but able to rest and ready themselves for the next struggle, for the next thing on the horizon. These years, I've been organizing actively since 2008. And a little bit before that, just attending stuff, not organizing, just attending and going to things as a young person, but actively organizing since 2008. And the language and rhetoric has shifted around sex work. Could it move more? Of course. Could the discussion around decrim, the discussion around the criminalization of survival, around abolition, of course we could see more. But my God, can we take stock for a moment of where we were and where we are now? I really want people to take hope and to take heart in that.
One important thing that we can never forget is those who didn't live to see a reality of decrim. December 17th is the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, a day we honor sex workers who have passed in the previous year. Lakeisha spoke of the New Orleans Black and Brown Second Line, held annually on December 17th.
The Second Line in New Orleans is a celebration. After a funeral, you have what's called a main line or a first line and it's a somber event to the cemetery, right? And then when you come back, the second line is a celebration. And the second line is something that happens all the time. On Saturday, there's second line. It is a celebration in the street. And so I wanted to have a celebration in the street for the sex workers who had passed on, to say their names and to celebrate them and to dance in the street and sing in the streets for the lives that they had lived and lived fearlessly. Memorialize Black and brown sex workers who were killed every year. Read off the list of names. And there's power in that gathering, right? The remembering of like, oh no, we're not just going to allow sex workers to be killed and not remember who they are, that these are people, they are community members, they are loved. We remember your name. We're going to say your name and speak it out loud and let people know that sex workers matter. Black and brown sex workers matter.
After asking what the day after decrim would look like, we asked a lot of people about their hopes for the future.
Here are Elizabeth's hopes.
I would love to see more support for individual activists and more support for sex worker-led orgs in mentorship and like for folks who want to organize and do policy work and do media. More mentorship, more development for free. Like I have a skill to share, like skill sharing from other activists, but also folks at nonprofits, so that there can be a strong sex worker-led movement for decrim and other policies. I would love to see those policies pass with like full-throated support. I would love to see non-sex working people use their mouths more in like social situations. I would love to see robust rallies and actions, because I know in Chicago, most of the things we have, like 20 people show up.
Kate hopes the movement gets over its internal strife and trauma coping.
Hope we work out our shit. I think a lot of the internal pain and a lot of the lateral violence that happens is not just about trauma. It's not just about the fact that a lot of us have learned horrible coping mechanisms that we play out on other people. I think that is a piece of what is undergirding certain things. I also think that one of the most compounding experiences of trauma is that people feel like they don't have an impact on other people. And this is just my speculation, my guess. But especially in seeing a lot of harm and a lot of who causes harm, I think it often comes from people who have been screaming into the void for such a long time that they've forgotten that they can hurt people. And that might be true when you're talking about systems, and that is not true when you're talking about people. And so I hope a lot of things. I hope that there's healing. I hope that there's more collaboration. I hope that as access and money and resources do move more into the movement, that it doesn't create more scarcity and more feelings of scarcity. I hope that we have faith in abundance. I hope we have faith in all the goodness that is here. And I hope that even the people that I want to stay far away from feel heard and seen enough in the pain that they have weathered to remember that they do have an impact and they are important and they are valid. Because I think that is a very significant piece of why people try to impact other people in the ways that they can, not positively.
Here's Blunt with her hopes for community and freedom.
I definitely hope for a future where bodies and labor and community are not criminalized and where everyone is free. I hope for a future where I don't have to fucking think about what I'm posting online and if it's going to risk my entire income. And beyond just like, I hope that we can like dream outside of just thinking about what we would do without all of this like surveillance and all of the shadow banning and all of the like platform deletion and all of the criminalization. But I hope for a future where it's just so easy to build community and everyone has the things that they need to take care of themselves and thrive.
Desiree hopes that sex worker rights become more a part of a larger progressive ideology.
My hope is that, those signs that say like, this house, we believe this is like Black Lives Matter, that sex worker rights will be somewhere in that narrative. Like people won't even think twice to say like, of course you have to think about sex workers. That's just what a good progressive does.
Jared is hopeful that all this suffering wasn't for nothing.
So my biggest hope is that we realize that we're all in this together. And I do think that there has been that reckoning, but I don't think that it's been everyone. And I also hope that it doesn't die out. So there's a lot of populations of sex workers. Again, I provide legal information to a lot of gay male sex workers. And these are people that I don't necessarily see. Cis gay men. I don't always see a lot of them in the streets or doing a lot of the organizing work. I hope that a lot of them get more involved. I hope a lot of other sex workers that maybe have more privilege that, maybe will tweet about COSA once or twice, upping their participation tenfold. I really hope that some of the most privileged sex workers who still are impacted by criminalization, who are still impacted by FOSTA, and certainly have their own fights to deal with, also recognize that we are really interconnected and that we don't lose out on that. That the progress that we've made as far as getting more people involved in these movements, I hope that progress doesn't die down once we start getting more wins. I really just hope that people that want to do sex work are able to do it as safely as possible. And for people that have been sex workers that don't want to do it, are able to find other jobs. I mean, really, I hope that we live in a society where, people, I'm going to get too much into Marxism now. Labor just looks different. Yeah, I think that ultimately the sex worker liberation movement, it's, one of the things that one of the reasons I find this movement just so beautiful is because, yeah, it's a sex worker rights movement. It's a worker rights movement, but it's so much more than that. It's about racial equity. It's about gender equity. It's, worker equity, of course. It's about art and it's about speech. And it's about just so many of the things that just make us so intrinsically human. It's about connection. It's about so much that I really do hope that one of the flowers that grows out of this movement is just a real recognition of the humanity of the people that do this sort of work and just ensuring that we're building systems that uplifts that humanity.
Thank you for listening to Let Us Survive. I'm Mickey Maud.
And I'm Tina Horn.
This has been a production of Hacking Hustling.
Let Us Survive was produced, written, recorded, and edited by Tina Horn and Mickey Maud.
Thank you so much to our interview subjects, Daniel Blunt, Red, Zara Raven, Lakeisha Harris, Desiree Collins, Jared Trujillo, Jubundu Ogwatu, Elizabeth Ricks, Melissa Jarrett Grant, Marla Cruz, Katie Simon, Kate Diadamo, and M.
Thank you also to the people and organizations in sex worker movements all over the world.
To find out more about this project and many others, please visit hackinghustling.org.